Great. Good evening. Oh, that's not going to work.
Good evening.
I think it's your iPad.
Your reader.
We just need to turn off your speaker.
Okay, so
Welcome. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a very full hour and a half. My name is Maddy Larson, and sorry, we have an audio issue up here. Just a second. Okay, here we go. I'm Maddy Larson, and I am your moderator tonight. I am a member of our Lake Forest Park Planning Commission, and I was asked to moderate this panel tonight. I was really excited to hear that it was happening. So that will transition me straight away into just taking a minute before we get started to say how grateful I am for the people who pulled this forum together. They are, let's have them wave at you for a second. Randy, do you want to wave? Randy? And let's see, Sally and Michael, great, Donna, and then Mark. And they were aware that there were some new laws in our state and came up to the city to try to learn more and decided that they thought it could be really useful and instructive to hold a community forum to give us all a chance to learn some of the things they had about changes that are coming to our community. And so that's why we're here tonight. So thank you, all of you, for having that vision to put this on. And thanks for the cooperation of panelists that I'll introduce in just a minute for being agreeable to spend a little time with us this evening. So with that, I also want to acknowledge that whether you've lived here a very long time or you're new to the community, that Lake Forest Park, from the indigenous peoples who have lived here and continue to live here and steward this land, to our stream keepers and stewardship foundation and policymakers and community volunteers, I think we all share a real deep love for Lake Forest Park and its well-being and its livability. And the work that we have in front of us is no different than the work we've had behind us. So I do feel very comforted and confident that we have some really bright opportunities to look forward to as we move into this conversation on housing. So with that, the only housekeeping items I have for you are to remind you that you pass the bathrooms on the way. If you have to go during the forum, you don't need to raise your hand. You just can let yourself out quietly. And I also want to note, can you hear me if I sit back? Or should I maybe go like this? Oh, that's better. That's a little better on the shoulders. I also wanted to mention that as we go through the forum tonight, there will be several opportunities for you to participate in question and answer portions of our session. And let's see, with that, oh, Matt left to advance the slides. Not a problem. So I kind of hinted on this a moment ago, but the purpose of this forum really is to build the critical context we all need to understand why we're even having this conversation, what's ahead for our community. Our council members did not change our city code or rules, but we have been asked by the state, as has everybody else, every other jurisdiction, to change their housing, their building code for houses. So tonight, we're hoping to share some information that will give you a good starting place for background on what those rules are and what that means for our community. And then, Matt, if you just go ahead one slide. Oh, thanks, Mark. Pregnant pause here. We're going to be covering a lot tonight, and I just wanted to share briefly with you kind of the format that we'll follow so you'll know what to expect as we move through this. And I guess I can read from mine. We'll have our panelists speak. First, we'll have Mark Phillips. He's a former two-term council member in our community. He's also a very active community volunteer. He's for many, many years supported Lake Forest Park Stream Keepers, Lake Forest Park Rotary, and is currently serving as vice chair on our Parks and Rec board. Oh, tree board. We'll then hear, and he'll talk about housing demographics to kind of give you a snapshot of what our community looks like when it comes down to brass tacks. And then our new Community Development Director, not so new now, but new to many of you, Steve Bennett retired within this last year, and we were lucky enough to get Mark over to our side of the city. And he's been wonderful as a planning commissioner to work with, and will be leading he's not only leading the charge to update as required by law our comprehensive plan, but also all of these changes to our housing code. And then we'll be hearing from our very own Mayor French, and he'll help kind of set the stage for the second half of our meeting, which really is getting into community conversation about where opportunities lie and how we might work together to take advantage of the laws that are in front of us. So with that, I think I'll just mention a couple of things. You can, we will send these slides out. If you leave your email, we'll send out all sorts of links and follow up to you so you don't have to remember everything you hear tonight. Let's see, anything else on my housekeeping list? And then I've kind of already introduced you all. So I think with that, in the interest of time, I'm only 1 minute over. I'll hand things off. We'll get things started with Mark Phillips, who will take us through a little profile of what our housing looks like in our community.
Okay, thank you, Maddie. So my job here is just to present a quick summary of some basic information about current housing status in Lake Forest Park. And for me, the key word in there is quick. I want to kind of move through it. You'll be glad to know I don't have a lot of slides to share with you, but we want to move through them so that there are some other portions of this program that I think are more vital or more germane to our conversation tonight. But I'd have to say, frankly, that in this material I'm going to share, I didn't find anything that just took me by surprise in terms of something really new about housing in Lake Forest Park. It's all stuff that I think has been in the wind and is probably familiar to you, has been familiar to me, but in some cases there were some kind of maybe some reinforcing of some thoughts that I'd been having about housing, and maybe something like that for you. So I'm going to share a series of slides, and I want to say that those slides were developed by an organization called the Leyland Group, Consulting Group, and they've been they developed these slides and the information in them as part of the work that they've been doing with the city for a year or 6 months to a year or something, helping the city in its effort to update our comprehensive plan. So credit to them for developing this information that I'm going to share. I do think, Maddie didn't touch on this, but I think we decided that we'd really like to hold questions till after Mark's discussion and later in the program. So if something strikes you about the information I present, do make a note of it. And it'd be perfectly fine to bring it up at a later point. So first of all, a slide here that just starts with some basic population information for Lake Forest Park. Series of graphs, really starting back at the 1970. That's only a decade, or 9 years after our city was incorporated. So it's kind of the history of the city here. Starting at the left, fairly even low population, 2,000 to 4,000 people for about 3 decades until the 90s. And then you see that big jump that took place, and people know what's going on there. Did you say a long series of annexations? Yes. The Growth Management Act created incentives for annexations to cities, including Lake Forest Park. So I think in the history of the city, there's been 40 or 50 annexations altogether, and many of them occurred during that period. And then and then it tripled the size of the city, essentially. So following over to the 2 bars on the right, you come to the one second from the end is our current population. It says 13,660. Probably that was last year, so maybe closer to 14,000 is probably a good estimate today. And then the projection of 20 years into the future, 2044, what that population could be, 15,066. So we're anticipating a kind of a slow but constant growth over the next 20 years, 10% growth altogether, but probably 1% or less than 1% a year is what we could expect over that time. Just another look at population and how that change has happened in relation to King County and Washington State. both the county and the state have experienced rapid growth as well, and even steeper growth than Lake Forest Park has experienced. The yellow line down at the bottom, which is kind of flattened out in the last couple of years. So that population that we have in this city, how are they distributed age-wise in terms of age groupings? And gosh, I know that's a little hard to see, isn't it? Mine certainly is hard to see. But it breaks the two charts on the left are Lake Forest Park, and that the left one is 2010, and then the one on the right of that is 2021. So you get a kind of before and after snapshot, although it is a little bit dated at 2021. I assume that the most recent information just was not available to the people who were digging this out. So you can look across. I'm really interested in the two Lake Forest Park charts. And for me, it's really hard to, I think, like I say, I didn't see great jumps there, but you could look at two of those age distribution groups, the one second from the bottom, the kind of light medium colored green, I guess it is, and see that from 2010 to 2021, there is an increase in population in that age group, which is 20 to 34-year-olds in the city. Something of a growth there. And then you can look at the top dark blue part of that chart and see that between 2010 and 21, there's also a growth in folks 65 and older in the city. There certainly is a narrative that I'm familiar with in Lake Forest Park, maybe you are too, that we are kind of an aging community. And this would seem to bear that out, although not terribly dramatically, but it also be kept in mind then that there's also groups of younger people whose the number of whom is also growing in the city as well. So we should not lose track of that in our thinking. Okay, yes, Maddy. Okay, this is my favorite, one of my favorite charts. It's pretty busy and it has a lot of information in it. And I just want to, it's looking at the different types of households in Lake Forest Park. And it's looking at family households and then something called non-family households in the two categories on the left. And just a few highlighted pieces of information there. Again, you can look across at the King County and Washington State and get some perspective on who we are in Lake Forest Park. We have a total of 5,308 households in our city, at least as of several years ago, as compared to 902,000 in some households in King County as a whole. So it's helpful to keep that in perspective in terms of our efforts in Lake Forest Park. King County, we know, has a tremendous housing problem. It's helpful, I think, to keep in mind in perspective, what our role might be in that, and really how hard it would be for us as a city to make an impact on that overall housing problem. Not to say that there's not plenty of creative things that we can do, but they may be not addressing the heart of what we think of as the homeless problem or the housing problem in the county. Just a couple of quick things to call attention to. Married couple families, 61% of our households in Lake Forest Park. And that's, so I guess, significant higher than in the county as a whole, which is 47%. And then, let's see, families with their own children under 18 in the household. And we got 29% of our households have children under 18 in the household. Slightly higher than King County as a whole, but probably not a meaningful difference. So non-family households would be people who are living together and not related people who are living together. And it's either, so it might be several people who are roommates, or it also includes a category of single individuals making up a household. So, and it only calls out, there are more, but it only calls out those two categories in this work. 24% householders in Lake Forest Park live alone. And householders 65 years and older makes up 7% of our households. Another look. This one's looking at the type of housing. So how many of you remember Pac-Man? This is kind of the Pac-Man chart. Remember that? This is saying that the large green part of that chart is our single family homes. And that's not a surprise to any of us that that's the predominant form of housing units that we have in Lake Forest Park. All of those other types of multifamily housing makes up about 18% of our housing units in Lake Forest Park. So this chart is talking about tenure. And tenure is a simple concept. It's just who resides in the homes. Is it the homeowner or is it a home that's being rented? So it's home ownership or renting. And there's owner occupied houses in Lake Forest Park predominate as they do in King County and in Washington State. But as you can see from the chart, there's a somewhat higher percentage of homeowners residing in their homes in Lake Forest Park. And then just a kind of a follow-up chart related to that. Another, not a big surprise here, but the green shows, the green again is home ownership in this one, and the yellow is renters. And so it's showing that over time, as we age, the different age groups that those bars represent, as people get older, they tend to be a higher percentage of home ownership, which I think probably is pretty straightforward. Okay, here's a chart I like. Two charts actually, and it's showing it's showing two. The one on the left is showing we just rework this a little bit. See, the one on the left is showing that the number of households. Gosh, I'm sorry. Take a look at that. We reformatted the slide a little bit earlier to make it clearer. So the chart on the left is looking at the size of our housing units by number of bedrooms. That's a chart on the left. The other chart is looking at the size of the households that make up Lake Forest Park. And so what it shows is that 76% of housing units in Lake Forest Park have more than 2 bedrooms. So 76% of our housing units have more than 2 bedrooms, while 75% of our family units, our households, are 3 people or less. So I just thought there's an interesting kind of almost a mismatch of some sort going on. I'm sure there's grist for thinking about housing there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I think there's something that's basic to stuff that we'll want to be thinking about in terms of housing in the future. Now we're just talking about population growth in Lake Forest, or home sales prices, I'm sorry. This again is not a surprise to any of us, especially if anybody who has purchased a home recently, I suppose. In the course of this graph from 2012 to 2023, that blue line is a 6-month rolling average of the sales price of homes in Lake Forest Park. And that turns out to be a 180% increase over that time. So 100% increase is doubling in price. 180% is almost tripling in price, value of the home over that period. And so that chart ends at a value of just over $1 million for the medium priced home in Lake Forest Park, at least as of 2023. That was housing. This is rents. So what's happened to the cost of rents in Lake Forest Park? The two lines at the left are Lake Forest Park and King County. They follow a fairly similar route, and the other line is Washington State. But King County and Lake Forest Park have about a 75% increase in the cost of rental units. And that's an average of small rental units and large rental units is apparently how that figure is arrived at. This also looks at rent increases. In Lake Forest Park and the county, and it looks at, flip the page. It looks at what I just mentioned, the cost of housing and how the price of homes have risen, as well as the price of rentals has risen over time, and then adds in the additional variable, the yellow line of income, household income in Lake Forest Park. So it was kind of a similar rate of increase for a while, but it's not income have not kept pace with the cost of housing in Lake Forest Park, and especially looks like over in the last couple of years where that income line has kind of flattened out. So this chart is just interesting, introducing the concept of cost burden. And you may be familiar with this. Cost burden is if a household is spending 30% of its income, 30% of its income on or more on its housing, it's considered cost burden. If it's spending 30% or more of its income, if it's spending 50% or more of its income on housing, then it's considered severely cost burdened, which would be the yellow part of that chart. So for all households, all of this information here is Lake Forest Park. Is 23% of our households are either cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And looking at renter occupied, the percentage is higher. It's closer to 50%. And then those owner occupied homes, it's only about 18% of cost burden. But so cost burden is a reality for many people in Lake Forest Park. This chart is looking at, again, the concept of cost burden. And it's just looking at cost burden in terms of several types of households. Small family households on the top have experienced less cost burden. I suppose that makes a certain amount of sense, doesn't it? Larger families, other things spend money on, I guess, experience a greater cost burden, larger houses. Elderly people living alone in Lake Forest Park is that third graph, that third line down, and that's the highest percentage of people in Lake Forest Park, either cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And elderly people living together in a family situation, the cost burden rate is a little bit lower. Okay, here's the one I really love. This is something we all know. I think we've known or we read this in the paper, but this is a chart that kind of puts some flesh on it. So this is looking at the concept of affordability. And it's affordability of homes in Lake Forest Park as compared to the different income groups and what a particular income level means in terms of housing affordability, using the kind of basic tests that a mortgage writer would use in terms of determining whether it was going to make a mortgage or not. So do you see the bottom left? You can see that if the little green box at the very bottom left, that would be an income of $50,000 per year. And next to it is the blue bar is that income level, $50,000 a year, could afford a home of $190,000. And there are not many of those in Lake Forest Park, I know. So just following along then in this chart, the next one, income of $100,000 could afford a home of $380,000 value. So that's the idea of this chart. So then it also superimposes a couple other factors in here, like you see that faint yellow line at the bottom. That would be the medium. That's medium household income, which is about $150,000 a year for the medium household income for Lake Forest Park, $150,000 a year. And then that faint blue line at the top is the median cost of homes in Lake Forest Park right now. So the point of this chart, is that little cutout in the middle points out, is that a household earning $250,000, the bars second from the right. If your income was $250,000 a year, you would not be able to afford the median priced home. The blue corresponding bar falls just below that blue line. So you'd have to have an income of $275,000 or $280,000 or something on that order to afford what is the median priced home in Lake Forest Park. And takeaways are always risky, but I'm going to just some of the things that I thought you could pull out of this information quickly. There is a population growth in Lake Forest Park. It's relatively slow, but we can expect a 10% growth by 2044, about 1,400 additional people in Lake Forest Park by 20 years from now. And over the last 10 years, the number of people in the 20 to 34-year-old range and people 65 and older, those two age groups have grown more than other age segments in the population of our city. 24% of housing units are occupied by a single person, while studio and one-bedroom homes make up only 9% of the housing units. 76% of housing units have 3 or more bedrooms. 75% of households are 3 people or less. 23% of residents are housing cost burdened, and most residents cannot afford to buy the medium-priced home in the city. And finally, among seniors, over 50% are housing cost burdened. That is, they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. I think we probably just move on from there. It'd be tempting to talk about other takeaways or other things from here, but that's just some basic information that we thought might be helpful just to start the conversation about what's going on with housing in Lake Forest Park.
Thank you so much, Mark. Just to mention, if you leave your email address, we'll send you links to the report that these were taken from, and there are at least twice as many more charts and slides with information. So we will send that to you. And then we are going to move directly to Community Director Hofman. He'll speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have about 5 minutes just for some technical follow-up. We'll hear from Mayor French, and then we'll have general Q&A for the panelists before we move to the next section. I'm sorry for not saying that before. And also not saying before, welcome to the 31 people in our community that have joined us over Zoom. If you have questions as you go, please put them in the Q&A section of your Zoom webinar. Okay, with that, Mark, you have about 10 minutes.
Perfect. I know some of you. I'm relatively new here. I can't say I'm new anymore. I started in January, came from another city in the middle of a major comprehensive plan effort. So I wanted to introduce myself. More or less, I am a staff member hired by the city. I work with the Planning Commission, City Council. I do planning, building, code enforcement, economic development for the community. And I'll get closer so you can hear me. This is a huge topic. So the challenge this weekend was to summarize in 10 slides or less, 10 minutes. Today, during work, I condensed it. I left some slides that may be appropriate to questions for after. I want to focus on 5 slides that more or less talk about the purpose or focus of tonight. This is a community originated discussion, but my presence here working for the city is more or less represented by the city's more formal process for this housing issue. So that's my role. I'm going to touch on Growth Management Act and recent legislation at the state level, or try to, and talk about our periodic update and then our development regulations update. These are huge topics. Each one could take a week. I'm going to try and do it in 5 slides. So I apologize if it's too brief, too simple. All this information is on our website. And it has a lot of acronyms. And so I'll try and call those out. Yeah, please. Yeah, I could take notes. Next one. This exhibit represents the structure or format that the cities and county work in the state. That the highest level, it's the House and Senate governor, and what's known as the Growth Management Act. We have to be consistent with and meet the mandates at that level. At the regional level, the 4 county Seattle metro area, I'll try and name them, Pierce, Kitsap, Snohomish, and King, are represented by Puget Sound Regional Council. You may have heard of them through a document that they update and adopt called Vision 2050. That regional level overview contains all the regional policies and plans, the regional transportation plan, primarily. The next level is the county, King County. They have what's called the countywide planning policies, very similar to our comprehensive plan, We have to be consistent with that as a city inside King County. At the local level, that's where the light green in the exhibit shows up. That's Lake Forest Park. That's your adopted comprehensive plan. In the past, it was required to be updated every 8 years. After this update, it's required every 10 years. That contains the adopted vision, mission, policies, goals at a very high level for the community. It's very different than the 3 other levels in that it is community driven. It captures your vision. It has to be consistent with the other 3, but the local level is captured in the green. So where to start with that? With the Growth Management Act, we must be compliant. There is a long topic called growth targets. And since the topic tonight is housing, the housing growth targets that you may have heard of are mandated through the countywide planning policies. They must be adopted. Some of the legislation in the last 4 years has changed that and how we achieve that in this new effort. But the most important takeaway, I think, tonight is housing capacity and the housing growth target. That tells the story of what the local efforts are trying to achieve. So in this diagram, you'll see 870 new units. That is the growth target allocated to the city of Lake Forest Park as part of the regional growth expected through 2044. Every city's different. Every city gets a different share. Lake Forest Park over the last 3 years has been assigned 870. In the past, you just had to achieve that or plan for it. There have been some legislative changes recently in the last 4 years on or mandates on how the local jurisdiction does that. But the column on the right is capacity. So if you see the light blue, the important takeaway is if the city does nothing in the way of new policies or goals or implementation, the traditional growth rate would result in 6,191 units, just traditional growth represented by the demographics. The dark blue is the baseline existing inventory. If you add the housing target that is supposed to be planned for, it's 6,416. So you can see it's 225 units over traditional. So we're not talking much in the way of policy change, but some policy change. And that's the effort in the comprehensive plan. The other difference is the light blue is through 2035. The dark blue and the 870 target is through 2044. So even if no capacity is added past 2035, there's 1,000 units that still could be accounted for with the existing capacity. So it's not doom and gloom, but it involves work. So what is that work? I'd say the major changes, it's hard to summarize 4 years of legislation. So if you've been following it, it hasn't been an easy task. 4 years ago, House Bill 1220 passed, made a major change to the goals of the Growth Management Act that we have to adhere to. In summarizing all of that legislation, the primary change is that before the wording was, we must encourage the availability of affordable housing. House Bill 1220 changed it to, we must plan for and accommodate affordable housing. So it's a semantics, but it's very important. It represents all of the other legislative efforts that followed it. And the idea being that you can't just continue with what you're doing at a local level, but you must implement statewide policies. So with that, the 2 more recent ones, start with the middle one, accessory dwelling units. As they attempted to address the affordable housing issue, I'll call it the low-hanging fruit. Affordable dwelling units, for the most part, are already permitted by right by most cities. You can call them granny flats, you know, the shack in the backyard where your college student lives with a kitchen. But it's an alternative housing that had traditional restrictions, owner occupied, can't sell it, etc. They were permitted by right. Not many of them were being built. but it is a form of a different size of affordable housing that begins to address the overall regional issue. So 1337 mandated actual requirements that must be implemented in local codes. House Bill 1110 is much bigger. That deals with housing types. You may have heard of it as the missing middle or middle housing. There's a big gap between traditional single family development and multifamily. Middle housing is everything in between. It's a housing type. So it's not large scale apartments, large scale condos, 10 stories high. It's duplex, it's ADUs, it's triplex, it's cottage housing that haven't been built in decades. The market's very good at building single family, very good at building high dense multifamily. House Bill 1110 attempts to mandate certain requirements that encourage and plan for those other types of housing. Every city has, based on size, has a different requirement. And there are a lot of other bills, and there are more coming for transit-oriented development each session, but it's clear over the last 4 years, affordable housing has been a primary focus of the legislature. So this next slide builds on the demographics and a lot of the facts in Mark's slides. And it attempts to show the difference between the old GMA and the new. So in the past, 870, you just up your growth rate, change your zoning, achieve the growth target and move on. More of the same, more single family, more multifamily. House Bill 1110 mandates and 1220 mandates it's all income levels in the community and all types. So each bar is a different income level based on the area median income. And you'll see that the taller bars are more or less represented by single family. The market does really well in achieving those. As a breakdown in the community, those are being met. The growth target doesn't require much change to achieve the blue lines on the top of those stacks. Where you see a lot of blue is on the far left. That's the affordable housing lower income levels. So House Bill 1110, 1220, 1337 is really aimed at those larger blue areas, especially less than 80%. On the green is, I wanted to include it, that's a emergency housing, homeless. So that's part of the legislation, but too detailed to go into tonight. So the mission is, how do we achieve that? How do we meet the mandates at the state, regional, and county level in our comprehensive plan and development regulations that plan for and accommodate those blue, we'll call it yellow, and green areas? And then next slide, please. It's impossible to go into how to achieve that. Missing middle is zoning, land use, setbacks, heights. That's coming. I wanted to highlight 3 major efforts that are going on in the city that events like this forum inform. The feedback is key. Our process is more formal. Planning Commission, City Council, public hearings, notice. We've done 1.5 years of that effort, and the goal is to complete these 3 major efforts. It's really 2 related to housing, but I can't resist throwing the climate planning in. The primary one you've heard about is the 24 periodic update of the comprehensive plan. That's due by December of 2024. Typically, the first year is at Planning Commission, second year is at City Council. In Lake Forest Park, last year was a lot of visioning and mission. From January through September 10th, it was Planning Commission. They've made a recommendation. We have a recommended draft that we're going to post to the website. From here to December, it's going to be at City Council for consideration, review, public hearing, and adoption. The second effort is at a non-policy level. Those are the development regulations. That's the municipal code, much more technical. It's not necessarily the policy. So the housing policy is, in theory, captured in the recommended draft, now going to City Council. The development regulations that we apply to specific properties are next, and we'll start those October 8th with what's known as the that's the next one, with the Planning Commission and a consultant. And we have until June of next year, 2025, to adopt those. So start at Planning Commission, get to City Council. The reason being is part of the mandate is that if a local jurisdiction doesn't adopt them by the end of June, they're subject to what do you call it, model ordinance. And I don't want to speculate on whether this community wants to be subject to that or not. We're assuming not. And so that local control needs to be captured in this development regulation update. So it's just starting and will be at Planning Commission. The last one is a $500,000 grant we received, Department of Commerce, Climate Commitment Act. King County was already well underway, and the cities were well underway with the heavy load of the periodic update. So we don't have to have that element, standalone climate element, till 2029. But the grant funding went further than expected. Lake Forest Park was awarded the grant. The City Council accepted the grant. We hired a consultant, Cascadia. And so the intent is to do that as a standalone element in the comprehensive plan by next June in draft form, and then adopt by next December. So it's all related. I would say that third effort does affect housing, but is not housing specific. So there's a lot going on over the next year and a half, reflective of the last year and a half. So as Maddy said, the next period, since the first two presentations are highly technical, data-driven, policy, give an opportunity to clarify if there's any acronyms or questions, but more specific. The Q&A later is intended to be the broader interaction.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we'd like to take just a few minutes to answer any technical questions you have before we move on, at which time there'll be an opportunity for more general questions or comments. Yes. And actually for our people online, if you don't mind, we've got a couple of mics that we'll pass to you, and that way the folks online can hear. If you're online and you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
So when you talk about the affordable housing that's coming, which I'm sure we'd all be relieved to see a little more affordable housing in Lake Forest Park, is that going to be federally funded, the state, local? And how does that happen to get affordable housing? Because right now, affordable housing in the rental market is beyond belief. If you've checked what the rents are throughout the greater Seattle area.
Turn off one mic so we can.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Not necessarily. It's not precluded, but most of this legislation I would classify as market rate. Middle housing is not subsidized. It's different housing types at a single family scale. So that units at a smaller scale then affect the cost to purchase. It doesn't preclude elements like that, that the larger cities, Bellevue, Seattle, partnership with Arch, especially in the emergency and or supportive housing. But this isn't characterized by that. It's
So-
ADUs, which potentially could be sold if the regulations get changed, and duplex, triplex, and so forth, which is not subsidized.
Okay, so they will go at market rate,
Middle housing, yes.
which is not affordable.
Well, the important distinction is that this is not expanding single family homes. This isn't a choice between put a regular size single family home on a lot or three. This is put a single family home on a lot, if you choose voluntarily, or 3 units at that same scale. And then provisions so that each one of those smaller units can be sold at market rate for that smaller unit, which is still relatively high. It would make a dent in some of the demographics, but it's still very expensive.
And would rentals be included in the numbers? So if the town center ever does develop and put in 300 units to rent, that counts as our, goes towards the numbers that we need to develop?
The creation of those units would go toward the growth targets, but none of this speaks to for sale or rent. Somebody would own them, but it doesn't address rental.
And I just want to make sure we can get to some other people's questions. I want to clarify, tonight's just the start of a conversation. When you start drilling down into housing, there are so many different classifications for housing. There's emergency shelter, there's subsidized affordability. And what we're talking about with the middle housing right now that is absolutely coming quickly is an effort to increase the diversity of housing, particularly the size of a house, since rentals and sales prices are calculated off of a per square footage basis. How can we get effectively more smaller homes in our community that, while not technically affordable, provides a different entry point for folks? So let's see, we can maybe take a couple more questions. Sally, did you have your hand up or?
Hi, let me see if I can get what's here out to you. So I saw Mark's slides that was showing how in Lake Forest Park, we have a lot of houses that are kind of empty, right? And then then the other Mark talked about the Growth Management Act in which we have to have density. So what if we had, okay, so if there are 10 houses being built, but 100 people live in those 10 houses versus 10 houses and 10 people live in those houses, what do they count as density?
The units. And
What?
the units. All this legislation is based on units for ease. You need a bill, it needs to be understandable, it needs to be implemented. The reason is, and I wouldn't understand why you don't do population, that it's very difficult, but whether it's 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 persons per unit, it's an average for the city, the region, and the state. And the legislation and the growth targets based on units.
Didn't understand.
I think we can take one more question. Celia?
Thank you. Are there any regulations in Lake Forest Park or the county that clarify the number of non-family members that can be allowed to live in one single family home or one unit?
Yes and no. No specific of what constitutes a family. You'd have to consult the Supreme Court and be a lawyer and so forth. You don't have to be related. That's a very tough element of code enforcement. What constitutes occupancy in a single family home? Codes are more based on square footage, number of bathrooms, public safety, public health, and they tend to stay away from, are you related? Are you a family unit, and how many occupants there are? So the building codes are more maximum occupancy, and they stay away from that family definition. Absolutely. Yeah. And then when that's exceeded, it becomes a public health issue, then you have code enforcement.
Thank you. I think what we'll do just to manage our time is now hear from Mayor French to sort of help move us into the community conversation. And he'll give us a little look at where we've come from and where we're going.
Thank you, Maddy. Thank you all for coming. And as Maddy said, I want to emphasize tonight that this is really the beginning of a conversation. We have a considerable amount of time, despite the fact that the legislation that has been back and forth for many, many years on middle housing and other topics makes it very confusing. The good news is, I'll start with this, that this community has been forward thinking through the good work of the Planning Commission and citizens here in the community about ADUs and DADUs. So additionally, we do have a lot of capacity that's available. So I would say, again, I'm hugely optimistic about where we can go. We have compelling needs for affordable housing. The question that you had raised, Robin, about whether it's going to be affordable is a challenge. Town center is very specifically, there's MFTE in the code. However, whether that would be incentive for the developer or the owner or loan guy to actually take advantage of that incentive is another story. Let me take us back a step, because as a community, our values about the natural environment and where we're interacting with each other as a sense of community, open spaces, the trees, everything else is really important. So I'm going to try to lighten the mood a little bit here with a little bit of history after a lot of technical stuff here, and we can come back to the community conversation about what solutions you think might be warranted for us to consider going forward. For those, I see a lot of new faces and a lot of faces that I have not seen previously before. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks online here who are new to our community. We have I think the number I saw a while ago, and Mark Phillips might know this answer. I believe 1/3 of our community is new in the last 5 years, potentially. So this history, I think, is kind of important, and I think it can inform the discussion going forward. Lake Forest Park is situated on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Duwamish and the Squamish tribes. For thousands of years before the European settlement, these indigenous peoples thrived here, utilizing the abundant natural resources of the land and the waterways. They constructed longhouses and other structures using materials like cedar, demonstrating a profound understanding of their environment. In the late 19th century, the story of the housing in this area takes a significant turn. The arrival of European settlers began to transform the landscape. In 1889, the city of Seattle was officially incorporated. Ultimately, our Ole Hansen, who started Lake Forest Park, became the mayor of Seattle. And the surrounding areas, including what would become Lake Forest Park, began to attract settlers seeking new opportunities. The initial housing development in Lake Forest Park was influenced by the area's lush forests, which are almost completely gone, all second growth now, and scenic waterfront. In the early 1900s, developers recognized the potential of this serene landscape as a residential area. Ole Hansen, who I mentioned before, along with his wife's nephew, A.H. Reed, some of their relatives still live within the community now, incorporated the North Seattle Improvement Company in 1909 with an eye to the future. In 1912, he created a very successful brochure inviting Seattleites to experience the natural wonder of Lake Forest Park themselves. Here, quote, "Here the laughing waters will forever make Gladstone the hearts of the sylvan dwellers," unquote. Further, quote, this park is not to be, and this is the most important quote, I think, not to be just the playground for the excessively rich. And thank you, Donna, for sending this to me earlier a couple weeks ago. This park is not to be a place where 500 millionaires will exclude all others. Resonates, doesn't it? Looking at the demographics and the income levels you have to qualify for affording a home in this community. The first significant housing projects emerged in the 1920s, showcasing the arts and crafts architectural style that emphasize craftsmanship and a connection to nature. You can see many of those homes on our wall in the staircase there. These homes were often built with local materials, reflecting a harmonious relationship with the environment. In 1935, this is something I didn't know before, the Lake Forest Park Improvement Club was formed. This grassroots organization aimed to promote community development and preserve the natural beauty of the area. Their efforts laid the groundwork for thoughtful planning and community involvement, which are hallmarks of Lake Forest Park today. By the mid-20th century, Lake Forest Park saw a boom in suburban housing. The post-World War II era brought a surge of new residents, many of whom were seeking affordable homes in peaceful settings. This period saw the construction of single-family homes, which is still predominant today, designed to accommodate growing families. The architectural styles evolved, blending ranch style and split-level designs that became synonymous with suburban America. However, as Lake Forest Park grew, so did the need for community services and infrastructure. In 1961, Lake Forest Park incorporated as a city, which allowed for greater control over development and zoning. It was incorporated, for those of you who don't know, most of you probably know this, to fight them all. They lost. It is what it is. This was wetlands prior to that era, and that's why we had flooding for a long time, because it was filled in, not after 2015. The move was crucial in preserving the area's natural beauty and ensuring that housing development aligned with the community's values. That's what we're here to talk about today, community values and how they align with what we face at the state level. As the 90s drew to a close, I'm sorry, let me back up for a second, and Mark stole my thunder from about this. There were more than 50 annexations in the 90s, and it more than tripled the size of Lake Forest Park. We went from just a few thousand households to over 5,564 off the cuff, I think, now, today. As the 90s drew to a close, property values continued to climb and diversity of housing remained with predominantly single family residents and considerable shortages of middle housing. And that's a lot of what we're talking about here. Fast forward to today, and Lake Forest Park continues to be characterized by a lack of diverse range of housing options, challenging young families, seniors wishing to downsize, and those in essential services such as teachers and first responders. Housing affordability in Lake Forest Park is a distant memory. The city is committed to sustainability and preserving the environment, a reflection of its roots and the original connection that Indigenous peoples had with the land. While it is essential for our community to continue to celebrate its culture and ethos of environmental responsibility, we also need to be creative and forward-thinking about the need for creating more diverse and affordable housing. These two goals are not mutually exclusive. I'm going to leave it there. I've had a couple more thoughts, but I want to, in the issue of community conversation, I thank you all for coming. And this is the point where we actually get to do the Q&A.
Guess I need my mic. Well, thank you, panelists. That was a lot of information in a short period of time. We heard a lot about who we are by the numbers. We heard quite a bit about the things we need to do, the work we need to do to comply with state and regional law. And we have heard a bit about who you all know we have been for, as I said in the beginning, from the indigenous communities that have lived here over time immemorial to, you know, community members who are living here today and working to this, like the community members who arranged this forum. And, you know, what's really clear is that we're not going to unwind the state law that is in place, but it will require, as Mayor French said, creativity to think about, okay, you know, we have this sort of knotty problem. We need to change what is allowed to be built in Lake Forest Park. I would argue from, you know, listening to the community and the surveys that we've had, that there's a big appetite to see change. I think many of you would like to age in place and downsize, but where can you downsize to? You have children who would like to move back here. There aren't that many choices for, you know, a starter home. And I think we're all really interested in that. That doesn't necessarily get to affordability, but it does create more on-ramps for how you might enter into our community and how you might stay in our community in a housing situation that's appropriate for your needs. So that's really the work that lies ahead for us, is to find those exemplar models of things that would fit well in our city. And all you have to do is drive around to neighboring communities to see what's being built without that creativity, without that vision for what is that opportunity that is in front of us. And if left strictly to market forces, I think we're pretty clear what we'll get. We'll get big scale apartments, we'll get loads of 3-story townhomes, and more large single family homes. So it's going to be up to all of us to start to imagine what those other housing models look like. And with that, I'd like to leave just a couple of minutes for some general questions of the panel. And then we'd like to turn the mic over to you to start considering some key questions we've put together for you. So why don't we take just a few minutes? Does anybody have a very specific question from any of our panelists? That includes those of you online too, if you want to throw questions in the chat or Q&A.
Go here.
Okay, the question I have is in that it balanced here, that both, as I understand, both Sheridan Beach and Sheridan Heights have covenants in their deeds that dictate the type of housing that is to exist in both those communities. Is that overridden by what you're talking about or by the state, or is that maintained as part of the deed?
I can speak as an observer over the last 4 years in the sessions. That's been a major topic, especially by the attorneys that inform the House and Senate. I would say in general, as a summary, the new legislation honors existing HOAs, but regulates any new HOA formed after a certain provision is put in place from now on. And from the city's perspective, CC&Rs, HOAs are not to be considered. We don't read them. We review them when a new condominium project comes in, but we don't regulate them. That's through the courts.
If I might add, the legislature did consider trying to abolish an override CC&Rs for the previous two sessions. I think that they chose the path that they did because there's considerable public outcry over the removal of the CCRs, having them overridden. But I have been hearing, as a person who followed these housing bills for the last several years very, very closely, particularly this session, there still are rumblings about that particular option.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, it seems like the town or the city's growth has been pretty flat, probably limited by the amount of housing that's available that's getting added. And it seems like we're probably going to increase the rate at which we're adding housing. So is that going to affect the expected number of people moving here? So I'm just wondering if we're actually going to have enough housing for the people that are going to want to move here, if that makes sense.
Well, I kind of asked a question like that myself when I was looking at these materials, and as I understand it, the projection to 2044 of a 1,400 person growth was independent of the considerations of the Growth Management Act, which I think is consistent with what you were saying, Mark, that in terms of available capacity that's already there. So I guess if this is a new legislation that would be coming down, and that it could tend to increase and could affect that because this is a kind of an outgrowth or an addition to what I would think of as growth management incentives for development. It might have a small impact on that number, but hard to project what that would be, or even if it would be significant, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first question is, could you please remind us what year the redlining policy for LFP was rescinded?
I think that was Supreme Court decision was 1960. Gosh, I think it's 1968. I'm trying to remember. I shouldn't speak to it beyond that, but off the cuff, I think it was about that time frame.
And the next question is, what is the current status of state regulations for lots close to public transit? What areas of LFP will this affect?
In the last session, everything seems to work on a 2-year cycle, and housing has been a major focus in the last 2 short and long sessions. In the last session, there was a lot of talk about transit-oriented development. It ran parallel with the other legislation and could be seen as redundant or overlapping. That may come back in the next session or 2. It would affect the major corridors of 522 and 104.
Okay, thank you. This is a real basic question because it started out with, there's market forces, of course, that's kind of pushing this, and also the state and county mandates onto Lake Forest Park. And it sounded, if I kind of summarize, it sounded like in the next 20 years, we have to find roughly 1,000 new units. And is that kind of the idea? Something like that.
The 1,000 was referring to the capacity, the buildable lands study, King County, and has very much everything to do with the growth targets, but it's not the growth target. The growth target is 870 until 2044. So
Okay,
when we update the comprehensive plan, we need to plan for and accommodate that. The difference between the traditional annual accumulated growth rate and this growth target is about 225 units. So either this legislation didn't happen and the traditional growth rate gets us pretty close to the current target, or we enact local changes and achieve 225 more units.
Okay, so actually, my question is more of, what are the consequences, if there are any, if we can't or don't, find this growth?
Sorry, go ahead. From a planner's perspective, I'm an optimist, right? And so I use general words. We need to adhere to the mandates and legislation. We need to comply at the state level. We need to do so locally. At the regional level and the county level, we need to be consistent with it. It starts to become more flexible as to local control and how it's achieved. So those three things need to happen. But at the local level, whatever the legislature leaves us as a city, we need to take advantage of. And here it's preservation of natural areas, critical areas, trees. And so it's not intended that by meeting the mandate, being consistent with the CPPs and PSRC, that we need to ignore critical areas and trees and preservation. They need to go hand in hand. And so this balance to find changes to achieve 225 more units very much takes into account leaving all of those very strong regulations in place.
And I think what we'll do is move on to the next part. There will still be more opportunities to pose questions. Matt, if you can put the slides back up and take us to slide 32. We wanted to take a few minutes while we're together to think a bit about, let's see, the next one. We wanted to think about a couple of key questions, and we'd like to hand the sort of time over to you for just a few minutes to turn to your neighbor and think about what should our future housing code encourage. Think about the options that meet the needs for families and for people that we've talked about, whether it's aging in place or your children that want to move back into this community. Consider whether or not there are housing models that you've seen in your travels around our state or the region, or even in other countries. I know there's some really neat models up in the Quimper Peninsula that were brought over from co-housing models in Denmark. And then consider what values should guide changes to housing in LFP. We're not going to answer all of these in the next, 22 minutes, but take just a minute and talk with your neighbor and share sort of what's at the top of your mind right now. And then we'd like to open the last 15 minutes up thereabouts for more of this reciprocal conversation. We'd like to hear about what you're thinking about, particularly in response to these questions. So let's take just a couple of minutes. Oh, sure. Well, and it can be anything. What I'd really like you to do is just for us to stop talking for a minute and you to talk with your neighbor and sort of see what your neighbor's thinking about right now. These are just questions that you could consider. Things like, what should our future housing code encourage? Are there housing models from other communities, either here in Washington or elsewhere, that inspire you? Or you could talk about what values should guide changes to housing in LFP. Well, let's take just a couple of minutes and talk with one another for just a second. You are all, oh, pardon me, it's, you guys are quite the shy bunch. I want to encourage you to capture some of the questions that might be coming up in your conversations on the back of the papers that we handed out. If you're online, continue to put questions in the Q&A area. I know we're not getting to all of them, but we will capture them and respond to them on follow-up. But it take just about one more minute to wrap up your conversations and we'll turn it back to a group conversation.
I was incorrect about red line, it was 1977. I thought it was earlier than that. So I think the Supreme Court encouraged it or said it had to be done, but it didn't get done. I can't. Just not let me read without.
Okay. I think we'd like to make some space. Neighbors, participants, attendees, if I could have your attention, please. Hello, right, let's wrap up. We'd love to elevate some of the conversations you're having. And so I think we have our first volunteer in the back corner. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. And you can ask questions, make comments, wax on. I would ask that if you have the mic, try to limit yourself to about 1.5 minutes so we can get the most number of folks in possible. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is surrounding the ADU and the process of the permitting. And so how many, is there a backlog of permitting right now? And if so, what is the, we're talking about meeting deadlines for housing density, et cetera. So what is the process that maybe help expedite some of those permitting processes when somebody's turned in, a full sheet, all the boxes are checked, ready to go? Is
third person, but it's him.
Yeah, is there? Yeah. Thanks, Sally. Yeah. So is there a process to help, kind of expedite that?
And do citizens get priority over developers? I have it.
Oh. Yes. What's going on?
There's only 3 can be out at one time.
Oh. Shut it off, shut it off, shut it off. Okay, how do I do that?
Okay, I just wanted to say first, before we get started, I wanted to distinguish something for maybe those of you in the room that didn't pick up on this. Our code needs to allow for a certain amount of development and be in alignment with the state and the Growth Management Act. But it doesn't mean that those units are going to get built or that we have to build something. We just need to make sure it's allowable with capacity. And so we worked on the ADU code recently, and Tom's got a wonderful update to answer your questions. But I wanted to let you know that our city is pretty far along in the ADU updates. We've had some permits come in and we've got more work to do. So Tom, if you can describe that.
There we go. Thank you. It's funny, we were just talking about that, actually. I just gave the council the budget that I want them to consider. As part of the discussions I had with staff, I wanted to include in that budget a stock set of plans that were pre-authorized basically for detached dwelling units. I was told by our city administrator that actually in our professional services fund, we already have capacity for doing that. That is a top priority. It's been something that has been worked on, I believe now since 2015, people have been requesting it. I think it's an essential component, streamlined permitting. I think there are other aspects too that need to be considered as well. I honestly have some very serious concerns about the cost of the updated energy code, although it's well-intentioned. We were informed that the cost to a single family residence average size could be close to $30,000 or $40,000 with the updated code. And so if you're talking about an individual dwelling at a DADU, it's going to be pretty significant. And while we all want to do our part for the environment, I think that there's a point of diminishing returns, honestly, where you're talking about levels of insulation that you would need for Sitka, Alaska. I think we have to be cautious so that we're not pricing people out of the opportunity to have an affordable home. There's a sweet spot in there someplace, and I leave it to smarter people than me to figure that out. But we can do other ways we can find other ways than R60 insulation in our moderate climate. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Not at the policy level, but if you drill down into House Bill 1337, there are mandates that attempt to do that. In the past, it was in zoning, permit them by right, require a building permit, let them go. And you don't see many applications. Here you get 1 or 2 a year, even though they're encouraged. With House Bill 1337, I have a short list of mandates that may answer your question. They're just not incorporated into our local code, as the mayor pointed out. Those are minimum number of ADUs per lot, could be 2, could be an attached and detached, whereas right now you're allowed 1. Minimum ADU sizes will be addressed, dimensional standards, street improvements not being required, similar to short plats. Owner occupancy requirement is removed, which is huge. And the ADU, in theory, could be sold through unit lot subdivision like a condo. Those are huge changes mandated by House Bill 1337 to address that issue and encourage.
I just want to offer for a second that was huge. Our planning commission wrestled with that very item about owner occupancy. And part of the rationale of the planning commission for leaving that intact, which we now have to remove by state law, was the fact that we are already under so much pressure for our lower priced homes, like in the scheme, none of them are low price, but for the smaller and medium-sized homes, buyers are already in huge competition with folks that have a lot of access to capital and are looking to park their money and make money on their money. Corporations that are being, put together to run massive rental. Some of you are nodding, you know what I'm talking about. And we felt like that just put more pressure on our housing stock because it made it more attractive for investors versus families. And so that's something we're going to have to grapple with. And I don't know how we do that, but if any of you that are smarter than I am about what can be done, that is a big key for how we sort of protect our community from being a place that's simply a great place to park money from an investment versus a great place for a family to live and be part of the community. I see many community volunteers and members here, and it would just be sad if we lost that special sauce.
Hi, I'm a little concerned that you've underestimated the number of people who are going to come in here. I'm on the Climate Action Committee, and as you look around, we're going to be this region is going to be a place where climate refugees come from. After 110 days of weather over 100 degrees in Phoenix, we look pretty good, and I think it behooves us to anticipate increased in migration from people who are moving within the United States to places like ours that are fabulous.
Other questions? Other input, comments? Has anybody in their travels seen online? Somebody was talking about Quimper Village and or at least the aspects of Quimper Village. If you haven't been to it, anybody who knows me has heard me praise it. But what are some models that you've seen out on your travels? Definitely Google Quimper Village when you get home. It's a really cool model. Quimper Village, like the Quimper Peninsula, they're quadplexes. And they've been designed as a 55 and older community, but the housing itself is a really interesting model. They're all single story, small footprints. But what are some really interesting housing models you've seen? Take pictures of them, send them to our planning commission, our council, bring them up in conversation. What have you got here?
that is small houses and designed, and it's not for 55 and over, encourages people of all ages. And I would love something like that in Lake Forest Park, where you have small houses that use common resources.
Can we turn off one of the mics? Julie, thank you for your comment about that. I mentioned it just briefly in my comments, but the question of aging in place or opportunities to downsize has been a perennial problem in this community for more than 4 decades. My parents left because of lack of services, lack of opportunity to share with friends. And I think that is so critical. Cottage type housing, whatever that looks like. I know that that's a bit of a malign phrase when it comes to co-development, but there have been some really great communities or small pockets that have been developed around the Seattle and greater Puget Sound region that have been models for that kind of thing. And we've seen pictures of them. I think it would be great for us to find ways. You think about one of the only places we have in this community that's really senior oriented is Sherry Lewis House. There we go. Thank you. And so, I mean, you think about that. I don't think there's anything else that actually has a dedication to the question of seniors and kind of small footprint living. So that is something that has absolutely got to be a component of this housing diversity question and the middle kind of housing kind of question as well.
So I just wondered, and I did ask my neighbor, and she said it's true near her, there's a space near her, but when we're talking about something like that, which I would love, the kind of cottage housing, I'd love to downsize me, my one person in a giant house, but I don't want to leave Lake Forest Park, but there's nowhere to go. But how many lots are available for something like that in Lake Forest Park? Do we have enough empty space that we could build cottage housing somewhere?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was gonna start to, well, I think it's surprising the size of the lot that might be required. I think it may be that we tend to overestimate that larger lots are needed to do creative small dwellings on property. We certainly have a lot of lots in the half-acre range, and I think a lot that size certainly can accommodate 4 or 5 tasteful small dwellings. I know we had an experience with cottage housing in the past, and I was a member of the council at that time, and we authorized it, and then when we unauthorized it, it was a very painful process. And I hope we've learned from that, and I think we should be sure we've learned from that, because I think understanding why that didn't work for us in the past would be important to figuring out how we can make it more successful in the future. But I certainly agree with you that it's a very attractive kind of way to live, I think, especially for so many of us who would be great with a 2-bedroom house at this point in our lives.
Just as a follow-up to Mark's comment, I was on the council as well at the same time, and it was a good evolution of thinking, but I think it was maybe a little premature, and some residents were very concerned about increased density. I would say that the new legislation that's in place that Director Hofman talked about, the opportunity to have additional ADUs and requirement to be able to allow additional ADUs and DADUs depending on certain circumstances, the ability to have separate ownership is a very interesting one, because particularly for seniors and people who are looking to downsize, potential to build a smaller cottage and then sell off the main house, for example, or something of that nature. And I think there's far too many permutations to get into here, but it seems as though maybe there's some positivity out of some of the sort of prescription that the legislature has done that gives us a little bit more flexibility.
I just wanted to add to that, that right now, what is law, it will require us to amend our housing code to allow for duplexes on every single single resident property, right? And so not subdividing the property or selling it off as two parcels, but that a duplex could be there. So now you could have two owners. If you say you had a third of an acre with a single family house, you could now have a duplex in the same footprint, same restrictions on setback, height, the whole 9 yards, but you could sell half of your house and then live in the other half of your house, right? And so what we're talking about here is not required of us. And that is, what other things do we want to put in code? What incentives do we want to put in place that might encourage somebody to perhaps, if our city would allow it, to build maybe 4 single-story, 800 square foot homes instead of a duplex with 100 square foot units. And that's the creativity we need. We already know what we have to do to abide by state law, and that's just to allow the building of a duplex or the separation of a house into a duplex. But what other things do we want to permit or write into code? Mark made a really excellent point about the cottage housing. For those of you that weren't part of that conversation, that came forward from the community. There was a lot of excitement about it, but ultimately the community members that really were frustrated by it were more frustrated, if I recall correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, was that it didn't require enough on-site parking. And they were worried in their community that without adequate sidewalks and safe passage for kids and pedestrians, that was going to be a real problem. And so a perfectly good housing model was sort of killed because of a part of the code that wasn't implemented. And that's the sort of work we have to do together. Like, if we want to allow this, what things do we want to prevent, like environmental degradation or building homes that are huge, users and consumers of fossil fuels? That's all that nitty gritty stuff that we've got to work out. That's where our opportunity lies.
People here, if they felt
that's a good cue that we need to move into kind of closing. Matt, if you could bring up the next slide. Thank you so much, Sally. So what's next? I just wanted to summarize for you that for those of you that left your email, again, we'll summarize the meeting, send out some relevant links, access to all this information. So please turn that in on that slip of paper if you like. We also want to encourage you to talk about what you learned tonight with your neighbors. Get conversations going. That Catherine Hayhoe, for those of you who are familiar with her, says one of the best climate actions you can take is just to start talking about it with your neighbors. We had some really generous community members and staff that volunteered to host this evening, but what would you be willing to do? What conversations would you like to support? Do you want a roundtable discussion of housing models at Honey Bear over coffee? Think about that, and then certainly attend and participate in our planning commission meetings, our city council meetings, and definitely stay informed with what's going on at our state level. Advocate for your opinions. These new laws come into play, and there are many more on the docket. We're expecting other changes. So follow that and express yourself to your state legislators. And then to Sally's question, who in the room is really interested in continuing this conversation, and in what way?
Well, I wanted to, this is in a smaller way. I was thinking that what you could do for me would be to put in the city news bulletin, inviting people to come to my house who want to live in a small house community. So in other words, if we take action on something that's particular to us.
Please, yes. Could you leave your information with Donna? Thank you.
I'm on? Oh, boy. So a little context very quickly. I grew up here. I was in the demographics that I could barely see, though. That is one thing I would love to see in the next, because I think this is beautiful. I think that we should all be involved in this, and that all the rest of our community should be involved in all of these things. But we couldn't read anything that was on either of these. I was wearing my glasses. I don't think anybody could see anything. So I don't know everything that was on those. And I think that we would all love to. So maybe next time we could all read like what's, maybe make the main screen bigger or something. But my undergrad is in city planning. I've grown up here. My minors in sustainability and nonprofit management, like and I've been a real estate broker with my own brokerage for 20 years. So like I have different perspectives, and I don't want to see our community degraded to investors. I get calls every day saying, I have all these investors, can we please buy your property? No. I want to get a grant, develop for affordable housing on my own lot, because I know that's what we all I think we all came here for questions and answers about like what now is our city doing? Because I've been waiting for 2.5 years since the law passed for the city to say, okay, we have this code now that we've got in place for anybody who maybe isn't going to develop and have crazy market rate housing. Maybe don't let the permitting process, especially if you're an owner operated local resident, maybe don't make the permitting process quite so absorbent that it's like market rate is the gauge for how much your permit's going to cost, like how much the improvement's going to cost. If you live here, you shouldn't be taxed out of your own home, and you shouldn't be, so like don't increase the property taxes. Like these should be things, in other words, that I'm saying should be in part of the building code process is make it contingent upon whether or not it's local residents developing. Make it like, these are just some things that I think we all want. We all want sustainability. We all want to take care of like the place where we live and have community and have, God forbid, third place ever leaves. Like we have to keep this place, and this is our home. And so like, be a little more forthright with like, what's the city currently doing with our code, so that we can either develop in a sustainable and beautiful way that like keeps our own needs in mind, or do what we're doing and drag it out and have nobody really know what's going on, and we can't even be the developers of our own property in a sustainable and equitable and beautiful way that like keeps everybody in mind. I only want to do a little fourplex so that I can have people that can't afford everywhere else. Like I've been looking at grants. So anyways, I've taken more than my time, but there's a lot that we can do. And I think that if we continue these meetings, my goodness, we could go far.
I think that's great. And I think that I should have had you do our closing slide, because that's exactly the call to action. We have a small city staff, and those innovative ideas, those exemplar models just aren't going to come from a staff who's already overworked just trying to get our comp plan done, which we have to do before we can address those other pieces. And it really does take active and engaged residents to come up with ideas and come up with plans, come pitch to planning commission or council a really cool idea, that you have. But if we all sit back and wait for our city to come up with the next best idea for how our community is going to be so special, it's just not going to happen. It's not part of their job. It's our job. And so I ask each of you to dig in and think, what can you do? What can you bring to the table? What expertise, what good ideas, what model examples like Julie was talking about, exist out there. Let's do that. I've been on planning commission, and we almost never have our community there helping seed ideas and think outside the box. So planning commission meets Tuesday, the second Tuesday of every month here at the lovely City Hall, and our council meets twice a month, the second and fourth Thursdays?
That's correct.
7 p.m.
That's correct. Although the council has a lot of special meetings right now because it's budget season. So stay tuned, take a look at the website. It's published. You can subscribe to the calendar as well. That's a great way to go. A couple of milestones just really quickly to wrap up from our perspective. The comp plan will be considered by the council. It's as was indicated earlier, the planning commission wrapped it up on September 10th. So the council will be wrapping up by the end of the year. The planning commission will be considering the climate quotient of the comprehensive plan, and then needs to be wrapped up by June 2025 draft form. And then, of course, the big one is the question of middle housing. We have to have our own ordinance code crafted before the end of June of 2025. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for community engagement besides this kind of citizen-driven opportunity. So stay tuned. Again, look at the calendar, take a look at it, and there'll be news flashes going out as well.
Thank you so much for coming. Sorry, we're about 6 minutes over. Please be sure, Randy, if you'll raise your hand, Donna, raise your hand, give those papers to her, and we will, like I said, we'll send out information as follow-up and ask you what's next. So thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Well done. Good job, you guys.